The prison no one survived was Richmond's infamous Libby prison, where Union officers were confined in converted tobacco warehouse whose conditions deteriorated throughout war as Confederate resources dwindled and as overcrowding turned facility into death trap. Disease spread rapidly through cramped quarters where hundreds of prisoners shared space designed for storing tobacco rather than housing humans, inadequate ventilation and sanitation creating environment where typhoid, dysentery, and other illnesses killed prisoners as effectively as Confederate bullets killed soldiers on battlefields. Rats infested building in numbers that made sleep difficult, and that spread disease while consuming what little food prisoners received, their presence adding to misery that Union officers endured in prison, whose conditions violated any reasonable standards for humane treatment. Starvation resulted from inadequate Confederate rations that were barely sufficient for sustaining life, prisoners losing weight rapidly, and developing diseases associated with malnutrition that killed many before they could be exchanged or released. Union officers condemned to die slowly understood that their survival depended on escape or exchange, because remaining in Libby meant gradual death through disease or starvation that Confederate captors seemed unable or unwilling to prevent. In Confederate hands, where resources were scarce and where Union prisoners received lowest priority for food and medicine that Confederacy could barely provide to its own soldiers, officers recognized that waiting for official exchange might mean dying before liberation could occur. No one survived was rhetorical exaggeration because some prisoners were exchanged or released, but mortality rate was high enough that prisoners believed escape was only reliable path to survival when disease and starvation were killing inmates daily. Condemned to die slowly in conditions that gradually destroyed health, even of prisoners who had entered Libby in relatively good physical condition, Union officers began planning escapes that seemed impossible given building's location in Confederate capital, surrounded by guards and by hostile civilian population that would report escaped Union prisoners immediately to Confederate authorities. The tunnel that should have collapsed was engineering marvel created by Union officers using improvised tools in conditions that made sustained digging seem impossible without detection or without tunnel's walls collapsing and burying. Diggers. Union engineers secretly dig 60-foot tunnel through Richmond clay, using knives taken from dining area, spoons smuggled from Confederate kitchens, and bare hands when tools broke or when silence was necessary for avoiding detection by guards patrolling above. Using improvised tools that were inadequate for serious excavation work, but that determined prisoners employed with skill born from desperation, engineers carefully removed clay and disguised their work by disposing of excavated material throughout prison building, where its presence would not alert guards. Bare hands supplemented tools when digging required silence or when implements broke under strain. Prisoners' determination to escape overcoming physical pain and exhaustion that sustained underground work imposed on malnourished bodies. 109 officers escape into city through tunnel, whose exit emerged in vacant lot near prison. Escapees scattering throughout Richmond before Confederate authorities realized that mass breakout had occurred, and before pursuit could be organized effectively. Into Richmond, where escaped Union officers faced challenge of moving through Confederate capital without being recognized and reported to authorities who would execute recaptured escapees or return them to Libby under even harsher conditions. The most astonishing mass breakout of war succeeded through combination of engineering skill, absolute secrecy among prisoners who knew about tunnel, and luck that Confederate guards did not discover excavation before it was completed and before officers could escape. Of entire war, because no other prison escape involved such large numbers, succeeding simultaneously through such elaborate preparation. Libby Tunnel becoming legendary example of what desperate men could accomplish through ingenuity and determination, when death seemed only alternative to successful escape from Confederate captivity. The hell of Andersonville was deadliest prison camp in war, where over 13,000 Union soldiers died from disease, exposure, and starvation in facility that lacked basic infrastructure for sustaining human life. The deadliest camp, whose mortality rate exceeded any other Civil War prison, reflected combination of overcrowding, inadequate Confederate resources, and deliberate cruelty by Camp Commander Henry Wirtz, whose policies maximized prisoner suffering. No shade in Georgia summer, where temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees. Prisoners suffered from heat exposure without shelter from sun that beat down on open stockade where thousands of men were confined. No water except polluted stream running through camp that served simultaneously as drinking source and as latrine. Contaminated water spreading disease that killed thousands who had no alternative water source available. No walls besides guards positioned on perimeter, with orders to shoot any prisoner crossing deadline, marked 20 feet inside stockade fence, internal boundary that prisoners could not approach without risking immediate death from guards who were authorized to shoot without warning. With orders to shoot making escape attempts suicidal for prisoners who would be killed by guards before reaching actual stockade walls that were secondary defense after deadline that guards enforced ruthlessly. Andersonville represented worst of Civil War prison conditions, where combination of inadequate resources, overcrowding, and deliberate policies created environment where survival was matter of luck as much as of health or determination. Hell characterized prisoners' experience in camp, where death was omnipresent through disease, exposure, violence, and starvation that killed men daily in numbers that overwhelmed camp's capacity for burying dead with dignity. Bodies being interred in mass graves that would become evidence of war crimes for which Wirtz would be executed after war ended. The man who outsmarted deadline was Union prisoner at Andersonville, whose escape plan exploited burial details that removed corpses from camp daily for interment in cemetery outside stockade. One prisoner fakes illness convincingly enough that Confederate guards believed he was dying, and that fellow prisoners confirmed his deteriorating condition through spreading rumors about his imminent death that made guards less suspicious, when he eventually died during night. Disguises himself as corpse by lying motionless among bodies collected for burial detail, his breathing shallow enough that casual inspection would not reveal he was alive among genuine dead being carried from stockade. As burial detail composed of Union prisoners supervised by Confederate guards, who had become desensitized to handling corpses and who did not inspect bodies carefully before loading them onto wagons for transport to cemetery. Walks out among corpses loaded onto burial wagon where he remained motionless until wagon had traveled beyond immediate vicinity of camp and until guards' attention was focused elsewhere, his escape occurring when he rolled off wagon and disappeared into Georgia woods before burial detail noticed missing corpse, without single guard noticing because their familiarity with death had made them careless about, verifying that all bodies being transported were actually dead rather than living prisoners attempting escape through macabre deception. Among corpses whose numbers were so large that guards had stopped counting bodies carefully or inspecting them individually, prisoners' escape succeeding through exploiting guards' desensitization to death that was so common at Andersonville that distinguishing between dead and nearly dead seemed unnecessary when both would be buried soon. Regardless, escaping without detection demonstrated that even Andersonville's brutal security could be defeated through creative planning, exploiting guards' assumptions, and through willingness to risk death by lying among corpses in gamble. That escape opportunity would arise before he was actually buried alive. Imprisoned behind Union lines were Confederate officers held at Johnson's Island prison camp on Lake Erie, where location in Northern Territory made escape more difficult than from Southern prisons because recaptured escapees would catered escapees face longer journey returning to Confederate territory. Confederate officers trapped on island whose isolation in frozen lake made escape attempts during winter particularly difficult when ice conditions were unpredictable and when escaping prisoners would face hypothermia risk if they attempted crossing ice toward mainland. On Johnson's Island, location provided natural security that supplemented guards and fences, water barrier making escape more complicated than simple breakout from land-based prison would require. A frozen fortress during winter months when Lake Erie froze, creating ice bridge toward shore, but also creating conditions where escapees would be visible, crossing white ice, and where cold made survival without shelter improbable for prisoners lacking adequate clothing. On Lake Erie, whose proximity to Canada made it attractive escape destination for Confederate prisoners who believed British territory would provide sanctuary from Union pursuit, distance to Canadian border being relatively short, if prisoners could reach mainland and avoid recapture, whose isolation made it theoretically secure prison, but whose location also created opportunities for prisoners who could devise methods for crossing water barrier that was prison's primary security feature. Frozen Fortress characterized Johnson's Island during winter, when escape seemed impossible due to cold and ice, but determined Confederate officers recognized that same conditions, creating hardship, also created potential escape routes across Frozen Lake if they could survive exposure long enough to reach freedom. Behind Union lines in northern state whose civilian population would report, escaped Confederate prisoners immediately. Officers understood that escape required not just breaking out of prison, but also traveling hundreds of miles through hostile territory to reach Confederate-held areas, or to reach Canada, where they might find sanctuary from Union authorities. The train heist that almost started border war occurred when escaped Confederate officers, disguised as civilians, commandeered locomotive in attempt to reach Canada before Union forces could recapture them. Disguised as ordinary travelers whose civilian clothing had been obtained through smuggling or through theft, Confederate officers moved through northern communities without immediately attracting suspicion that military uniforms would have generated among populations alert for escaped prisoners. They steal train by boarding locomotive at station and overpowering engineer, their desperate gamble that speed would allow them to outrun pursuit that would be organized once theft was discovered by railroad authorities. Hijack locomotives in succession when first train was abandoned for faster engine, Confederate officers demonstrating knowledge of railroad operations that suggested some had civilian experience with trains before war. Nearly cross into Canada before being intercepted by Union forces that had telegraphed ahead to warn authorities about stolen train carrying escaped Confederate prisoners. Pursuit culminating in dramatic chase where multiple locomotives were involved in attempting to catch fleeing Confederates. Before being recaptured in chase that attracted public attention throughout region, Confederate officers' bold escape attempt, nearly succeeding despite improbability of stealing and operating train while being pursued by Union forces with superior resources. In Hollywood-worthy chase involving multiple locomotives racing across countryside with Confederate escapees attempting to outrun Union pursuers, drama of escape attempt exceeding typical prison break through sheer audacity of stealing train and through narrowness of margin, by which Confederates failed to reach Canadian border. Almost started border war was exaggeration, but captured diplomatic tensions that would have resulted if Confederate officers had reached Canada and if Union forces had pursued across international border in violation of British neutrality. Incident demonstrating how individual escape attempts could have international implications when they occurred near borders with foreign territories. Captured, starving, and surrounded described Confederate soldiers' situation in northern prison camp, where conditions rivaled southern prisons' brutality, despite Union's superior resources that theoretically should have allowed better treatment. Confederate soldiers face freezing conditions in camps located in northern states, where winter temperatures dropped well below zero and where prisoners lacked adequate clothing or shelter for surviving cold that killed many through exposure and frostbite. Starvation affected Confederate prisoners, whose rations were reduced in retaliation for reports about Union prisoners' treatment in southern camps. Tit for tat, reduction in food supplies, creating starvation conditions in northern prisons, despite Union's capacity for feeding prisoners adequately if political will had existed. Impossible odds against escape from camps located deep in Union territory, where recaptured prisoners faced hundreds of miles of travel through hostile populations before reaching Confederate lines or neutral territory offering sanctuary. And surrounded by Union guards and by civilian populations who would report escaped Confederate prisoners to authorities. Geographic isolation of northern camps, making escape attempts seem futile, when success required not just breaking out, but also completing long journey through enemy territory. Face conditions deliberately made harsh through Union retaliation for Confederate prison conditions. Northern camps' mortality rates approaching southern camps' death rates despite Union's superior resources, demonstrating that cruelty was policy choice rather than inevitable result of resource shortages. Freezing in camps without adequate heating or winter clothing, Confederate prisoners suffered from cold that Union authorities could have alleviated, but chose not to when political pressures demanded harsh treatment, matching reports about Andersonville and other Southern prisons. Impossible odds that Confederate prisoners faced when contemplating escape reflected both difficulty of breaking out of guarded camps and challenge of traveling hundreds of miles through Northern Territory where every civilian was. Potential informant who would report escaped prisoners to Union authorities pursuing recaptured Confederates. A 700-mile flight through enemy territory was journey that escaped Confederate prisoners undertook when breaking out of Northern camps, their route requiring them to avoid Union patrols and civilian informants throughout hundreds of miles, separating prison camps from Confederate territory. They steal civilian clothes from washing lines or from unguarded homes, disguises necessary for moving through northern communities without attracting attention that Confederate uniforms or prison garb would generate among alert populations. Forge papers creating false identities as civilians traveling on legitimate business, documents that would survive cursory inspection by authorities who might question travelers, but that would not withstand detailed examination by suspicious officials. Ride stolen horses when walking seemed too slow, or when speed was necessary for outrunning pursuit, their theft of transportation compounding original crime of escape, but being necessary for covering distances that walking could not achieve quickly enough. Avoid patrols through traveling at night, or through taking routes that Union forces were less likely to monitor heavily, escapees' knowledge of geography and of Union deployment patterns helping them navigate through enemy territory. On journey from Great Lakes region, where many northern prisons were located, to Deep South, where Confederate lines offered safety, distance requiring weeks of travel, during which recapture was constant threat. Through enemy territory, where every encounter with civilians or officials risked exposure and recapture, Confederate prisoners demonstrated resourcefulness in obtaining supplies, avoiding detection, and maintaining direction toward distant Confederate lines. 700 miles represented approximate distance that prisoners in camps like Camp Douglas near Chicago would need to travel to reach Confederate territory in Tennessee or Mississippi. The journey's length, making successful escape remarkable achievement, requiring luck and skill in equal measure for avoiding recapture during weeks of travel through hostile populations who were watching for escaped prisoners. The Andersonville of North was Elmira prison camp in New York, whose mortality rate approached Southern camps' death rates, despite being located in state with resources for providing adequate shelter, food, and medical care. Elmira, New York became notorious for disease that spread through overcrowded barracks, where Confederate prisoners were confined in conditions that Union authorities could have improved, but chose not to when political climate demanded harsh treatment. Disease killed thousands of Confederate prisoners at Elmira, where contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, and overcrowding created epidemic conditions that Union medical officers recognized, but that they lacked authority or resources for addressing effectively. Brutal winters in upstate New York, where temperatures regularly dropped below zero, and where Confederate prisoners from southern states lacked experience or clothing for surviving cold, that killed many through exposure and frostbite. Death rate nearly as high as southern counterpart. Andersonville reflected deliberate Union policies, reducing rations and refusing to improve conditions in retaliation for reports about Confederate treatment of Union prisoners. Tit-for-tat cruelty, making Elmira as deadly as Andersonville despite Union's superior resources. As high as Andersonville suggested that mortality was policy choice, rather than inevitable result of resource shortages. Union's capacity for feeding and sheltering prisoners adequately being demonstrated by better conditions in other northern camps, where different commanders implemented more humane policies. Nearly as deadly demonstrated that North and South both could create deadly prison conditions when political pressures demanded harsh treatment and when oversight was inadequate for preventing commanders from implementing cruel policies. Andersonville of North became Elmira's nickname among Confederate prisoners and sympathizers, who argued that Union criticism of Confederate prison conditions was hypocritical when northern camps like Elmira produced comparable mortality rates through deliberate neglect and through policies reducing rations and refusing improvements that would have saved lives. Digging out through frozen ground was a challenge that Confederate prisoners at Elmira faced when attempting tunnel escape during winter, when ground was frozen solid to depths that made excavation extremely difficult without proper tools. A group of Southern prisoners carved tunnel beneath frost using improvised implements and bare hands, their determination to escape overcoming physical obstacles that seemed insurmountable when frozen earth resisted digging attempts. Beneath ice and snow covering ground above tunnel route, prisoners worked in shifts, removing frozen soil and disposing of it throughout barracks where its presence would not alert guards to tunneling operations occurring beneath their feet, and snow that made surface digging impossible, but that also provided concealment for tunnel entrance that prisoners disguised carefully to prevent discovery by guards inspecting barracks for contraband and escape attempts. Escaping into blizzard that provided cover for escapees, whose tracks in snow would be obscured by continuing snowfall, but that also created survival challenge for prisoners lacking adequate clothing for traveling through winter storm. Into winter conditions where exposure could kill as quickly as Confederate bullets, escapees gambled that blizzard's cover was worth hypothermia risk, when alternative was remaining in Elmira, where starvation and disease were killing prisoners daily. Making it to Canada, where some escapees successfully reached British territory offering sanctuary from Union pursuit, their journey through blizzard, demonstrating extraordinary determination and luck in surviving exposure while evading Union patrols searching for escaped prisoners. To Canada represented escape's ultimate success when prisoners reached international border, and when British authorities refused to extradite Confederate escapees back to Union custody, their achievement vindicating risk of tunnel escape and winter flight through conditions that killed some escapees, but that others survived through combination of preparation, endurance, and fortune. Trapped after bloodiest battle were Confederate prisoners captured at Gettysburg in July 1863, when Union victory produced thousands of prisoners, requiring immediate confinement before permanent prison facilities could be arranged. Confederate POWs held in makeshift pens constructed hastily from available materials, temporary enclosures providing minimal security, but also minimal shelter or sanitation for prisoners awaiting transportation to established prison camps. After Gettysburg, whose 3 days of fighting produced over 50,000 casualties, including thousands of Confederate prisoners whose capture strained Union's capacity for housing and guarding captives, makeshift arrangements being necessary, because established prisons were too distant for immediate transfer. Surrounded by thousands of Union guards, whose numbers reflected both prisoners' quantity and Union determination to prevent escapes that would allow Confederate soldiers to rejoin Lee's retreating army, security was tight despite temporary nature of confinement facilities. No supplies beyond what Union could spare from supporting its own forces. Prisoners received minimal rations, and no medical care beyond what Union surgeons could provide after treating Union wounded whose needs took priority. No shelter except what prisoners could improvise from captured Confederate equipment or from materials that Union guards allowed them to use, exposure to elements adding to prisoners' suffering during days they spent in temporary pens awaiting transfer. Thousands of guards making escape seem impossible when surveillance was constant, and when any attempt to breach perimeter would be noticed immediately by numerous sentries posted around makeshift prisons. No supplies meant prisoners lacked resources for sustaining escape attempt, even if they could break out. Their lack of food, clothing, and weapons making successful flight to Confederate lines improbable even if initial escape succeeded. Makeshift pens, whose temporary construction created both security weaknesses that clever prisoner might exploit, and surveillance intensity that made exploiting weaknesses extremely difficult when guards were numerous and alert for escape. 2 attempts. The disguise that fooled entire army was Confederate prisoners' audacious plan to escape from Gettysburg temporary prison by impersonating Union soldier and by using stolen uniform to move freely through Union lines. One prisoner steals Union uniform from laundry or from unguarded supplies, his acquisition of authentic Federal clothing being essential first step in escape plan, requiring him to pass as Union soldier among thousands of actual Union troops. memorizes commands and military protocols through observing Union guards and through listening to their conversations, his preparation allowing him to respond appropriately if questioned by Union officers who might test his knowledge of federal military procedures. And marches himself out of prison area with supply convoy departing toward rear areas, his confident demeanor and authentic uniform allowing him to blend with legitimate Union soldiers without attracting suspicion from guards who assumed anyone in federal uniform was authorized to be present. With supply convoy, whose departure from Gettysburg battlefield provided opportunity for prisoner disguised as Union soldier to leave prison area without explicit permission, his presence among teamsters and guards being assumed legitimate because his uniform matched theirs. Walking straight through checkpoints where guards verified that convoys were authorized to pass, but where individual soldiers' identities were not checked carefully because numbers made individual verification impractical, when dozens of soldiers were moving simultaneously. Riding off into history after successfully passing through multiple checkpoints and after distancing himself sufficiently from Gettysburg that he could abandon Union uniform and attempt journey back to Confederate lines, his escape becoming legendary example of audacity succeeding where conventional escape attempts would have failed. Through checkpoints whose guards were focused on preventing Confederate prisoners from escaping, but who did not suspect that prisoner might escape by disguising himself as Union soldier and by confidently acting as if he belonged among Federal troops, boldness of disguise making it effective when more cautious approach would have aroused suspicion. The men who refused to be caged demonstrated that imprisonment could not break human spirit when survival instinct combined with ingenuity created opportunities for escape that seemed impossible to observers who underestimated prisoners' determination. These 6 escapes weren't miracles in sense of divine intervention changing natural laws, but were explosions of human will that sustained prisoners through planning and executing, escapes requiring months of preparation and extraordinary courage. Of creativity in developing escape methods that exploited specific weaknesses in prison security, escaped prisoners demonstrating problem-solving abilities that rivaled anything they had accomplished in civilian or military careers before capture, and desperation born from recognition that remaining imprisoned meant probable death through disease, starvation, or exposure that was killing prisoners daily in camps, whose conditions made escape seem preferable despite risks. They show that even in humanity's darkest prisons, where conditions were designed to break spirits, and where survival seemed to require accepting captivity until death or exchange, there were always men whose refusal to submit inspired escape attempts that sometimes succeeded through combination of planning, courage, and luck. Darkest prisons of Civil War included Andersonville, Libby, Elmira, and numerous other facilities whose conditions created suffering that modern standards would condemn as torture, but that wartime circumstances and deliberate policies produced in both North and South. There are men who simply refuse to die behind bars regardless of obstacles that imprisonment created or dangers that escape attempts entailed. Their examples demonstrating that human spirit could not be permanently caged when will to freedom remained strong enough to sustain extraordinary efforts. Refuse to be caged characterized prisoners whose escapes required overcoming obstacles that would have discouraged less determined men. Their successes, vindicating belief that freedom was worth any risk, when alternative was dying slowly in prisons that killed thousands through deliberate cruelty or through negligent indifference to suffering that authorities could have alleviated, but chose not to when political considerations demanded harsh treatment of enemy prisoners. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.